Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Presenter to... Hey everyone, bear with me for just a second. I had some technical difficulties, so I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen. Okay, I think we're good to go. All right, well, thank you everyone and welcome to our webinar on Latin America offsetting trends. So thank you again for tuning in. If you can't stay for the entire webinar, or if you have colleagues who can't make it, don't worry, we will be recording this, and it will be made available on foresttrends.org sometime next week. Also, if you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the question box on your screen. So I will begin this webinar by sharing our regional offsetting insights for Latin America based on two new reports that came out in 2017. The first is our State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Regional Analysis Report, and the second is the State of Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report. And then following me will be three panelists, and I actually have one correction to make here. So the first, and this is a little out of order, but the first panelist will be Gareth Turner from Mirko. The second will be Christian Danica from South Pole Group. Roberto, unfortunately, was not able to make it. And then finally, we'll conclude with Mariana Ayala Calva from Mexico CO2. And they will talk a little bit more about their experiences with voluntary and compliance markets in Mexico and Colombia, which should be really interesting to hear from. And so then finally, at the end of all of this, we should have about 15 minutes to answer questions once everyone's given their presentation. So once again, please do write in questions as you have them, and we will make sure we get to all of them at the end of the webinar. So before I begin, I'd just like to recognize the supporters and sponsors of these two reports. So both these reports are freely available thanks to all of the sponsorship that we got last year. So thank you once again. We really do appreciate it. So for those of you unfamiliar with Ecosystem Marketplace, a brief background. We're a program of the nonprofit Forest Trends, and we produce reports and articles covering the latest trends in ecosystem markets and conservation finance. So I'll be presenting regional offsetting trends based on information from the two reports shown here, and that's in 3 webinars. So this webinar is, of course, about Latin America offsetting trends, but we also had a webinar last week about Oceania offsetting trends, and we are going to have a webinar next week about North America offsetting trends. So if you're interested in that, please do register and attend next week. And so the voluntary carbon offset information will come from the report on the left, the State of the Voluntary Carbon Markets 2017 Regional Analysis Report. And the forest carbon compliance information I'll present shortly will come from the State of the Forest Carbon Finance 2017 report shown in the slide here on the right. So we define Latin America as all countries in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico. So this slide shows different types of markets for forest carbon offsets around the world. And if you look at Latin America, you can see that voluntary offsetting occurs everywhere in the region. That's shown by the pink outline. Aside from that, there are only 2 countries with current or upcoming forest carbon markets, and that is Mexico and Colombia. So you can see also here that both countries, both Mexico and Colombia, not only have compliance markets, either current or upcoming, but they also have voluntary programs that are sort of government run. So for my presentation, I'm first going to focus on the voluntary carbon offset findings for Latin America as a whole, and then sort of turn to dive in a little bit more deeply to discuss compliance market trends in Mexico and Colombia. So as you saw on the slide before, voluntary offsetting can really occur anywhere in the world. That's because the global voluntary markets are unregulated. So offsets that are developed anywhere can essentially be sold anywhere else. So this map shows voluntary forest carbon projects just in Latin America. But of course, what it doesn't show is there are a lot of voluntary carbon projects based on activities around energy efficiency, hydropower, and more. But you can see that there are forestry projects that are located in Brazil, Peru, Colombia, all over Latin America, and they sell anywhere in the world, typically to buyers actually that are not based in Latin America themselves. Which brings me to my next slide. So this map shows the voluntary carbon offset transactions for all project types that we tracked last year. Well, I say last year now. We tracked it in 2017, and it was for 2016 data. And you can see here that the total volume was 5.8 million tons tracked at an average price of $3.8 per ton. And typically, forestry makes up a big chunk of these types of offsets being sold. And typically what we do see on the voluntary markets is that Brazil and Peru are often the two largest suppliers in the region. And this was also true last year, as you can see on this map. The countries that are shown in blue transacted the most offsets. Countries shown in dark green were sort of the next most, and then light green were the least amount of offsets transacted. So what this slide shows is a bit more detailed breakdown of the types of voluntary offsets that were transacted in 2016. So as I just mentioned, 71% of the total volume we tracked came from forest carbon projects in the region. And that sort of differed a little bit by country. So in Peru and in Chile, nearly all offsets came from forestry and land use projects, such as tree planting, agroforestry, or other land management projects. In Colombia, Bolivia, and Brazil, forestry and land use offsets still comprised of more than half of all offsets transacted from those countries. But there were other types of projects that also were selling from those areas. So for example, some other project types that were also not quite as dominant but still sold quite well in Latin America include offsets from renewable energy projects, mostly from large hydropower and biomass biochar projects. And then also we tracked a few cook stove and gas projects selling offsets as well. You can also see here the sort of standard that these offsets were verified under. So most of the offsets that were transacted in 2016 in Latin America were verified under the Voluntary Carbon Standard, or the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS. And typically that was also in association with a co-benefit standard, the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Standard, CCB, or with social carbon. So social carbon, we typically don't see that paired up with offsets elsewhere in the world. And that's because social carbon was developed by a Brazilian NGO, Ecologica Institute. So mostly we just see this paired up with offsets that come from Latin America. And for the VCS and social carbon combination, most of those were around biomass biochar offsets, along with a few REDD+ and fuel switching offset types as well. And so then finally, I just wanted to sort of end our information about the voluntary transactions in 2016 by letting you know that we have a lot more detailed information around specific countries in the annex of our regional report. I know not everyone reads reports all the way through, so I just wanted to sort of call that out here. What I've included in this slide here is just sort of the overall country information, the volume, the average price, and the value. But we also do provide more insights into the project types and the standards, just like you saw on the slide before, for each of these countries, for the offsets being transacted from those countries. So there is really a wealth of data that's available there. And so if you have a specific country that you're interested in, I would definitely recommend that you go and check that out. So shifting focus a little bit, the information I was just talking about was about voluntary transactions across all project types in Latin America. But I do want to drill down a little bit more into what we're seeing just in Colombia and just in Mexico. So in Colombia, there is a voluntary carbon market platform that was launched in late 2016, jointly operated by the Colombian Environmental Ministry and Stock Exchange, and with support from the environmental nonprofit Fundación Natura. So this is a little different than sort of the global unregulated voluntary markets because it's sort of geographically bound just to Colombia. Which is kind of interesting to see. And one of the requirements for the platform is that all offsets that are sold through it must be certified and produced within Colombia. And then also there is, and I'm hoping our speakers will talk about this a little bit more, Colombia passed a carbon tax on fossil fuels. It's a $5 per ton tax. And companies can either choose to pay the $5 per ton tax, or they can purchase offsets, carbon offsets instead. And in 2017, companies could purchase offsets by VCS, the gold standard, the Clean Development Mechanism, or other eligible standards from anywhere in the world, essentially. But then in 2018, there's a new regulation that just came into place, which requires that these companies can only purchase Colombian-based offsets, or offsets from Colombian-based projects, including forestry projects. So that's something that is sort of a new thing that just happened the 1st of January this year. And then in Mexico, there's sort of also some interesting things going on. So there's the Mexico CO2, which is a voluntary domestic carbon trading platform founded in 2014. And I'm sure Mariana will give a little more detail exactly what they do, since she works for them. And then there's also an upcoming emissions trading system, which is expected to launch in 2018. Currently, the approved offsets are unknown, so we're not quite sure, if forestry will be included, or what types of, if there might be any voluntary standards that might be recognized. That's still sort of in the works. And then also Mexico also has their own carbon tax on fossil fuels, also a $5 per ton tax that was launched in 2014. And until now has not allowed companies to purchase offsets instead of the tax, but that is something that they might be considering doing in the future, which would be really interesting to see. So with that, I hope you have a bit better of a sense of sort of the overview of everything that we're seeing in Latin America. But I do want to turn now to our panelists, who actually have very specific experiences of working in these different markets, and I think we'll have some really interesting insights to share. So let me first turn to Gareth Turner, who is the co-founder and director of Carbon and Renewables at Mirko. And Gareth, let me know if you can, if you get the share screen button, or if I should resend it. You also might be muted, Gareth, in case you're trying to talk.
Oh, no, I'm here. Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to find the right screen. Just bear with me. Okay, are we there? Can we see?
Yep, I can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. Just a little bit of background on Mirko. We're a wholesale fuel supplier, and we've been working the carbon markets for a number of years under different guises. And we set Mirko up about 5 years ago, and the team are based in multiple locations. Main office in London, office in Brazil. Yeah, many of the counterparties will know us from over the time in different mechanisms. So EU ETS, joint implementation, and obviously large player in the voluntary carbon market. Won multiple awards over the years. Member of the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves and so on. Here we go. So yeah, different locations. So Sao Paulo, Warsaw, and then in the States, but head office in London. With regard to the Colombian carbon market, we were one of the first players to be involved. It's been an interesting few months since everything kicked in June. And as part of the tax reforms, as Kelly's already mentioned, international offsets were eligible initially, 2010 plus vintage, and as long as they were not registered under any other scheme, so pure voluntary. From this year, from January, only domestic credits, Colombia projects have been allowed, and that's what everyone is now focusing on. The system itself was fairly simply explained. There's a tax of around $5 a ton, 15,000 Colombian pesos, which is adjusted, and it's the taxable entity who will submit documentation. They can either choose to pay the tax or buy international offsets, or now domestic offsets, obviously if there's a saving or if they're looking to make investments in the country. And they have to submit documentation into the full fuel producers and importers, so Ecopetrol, etc. That comes in the form of fairly simple retirement certificates that those who are active in the voluntary carbon markets will know from the registries. Then there's different certificates from the VCS and from the APX registry and the market registry, and those kind of lead into something we'll come on to later. But these are the fuel tariffs that are mentioned in the tax reform, applying to the different fuels, which is obviously then leading on to the different costs depending on usage. In terms of a snapshot of the market, over 3 million international offsets have been retired to date. There were a large number of projects at the beginning that had big volumes, some large hydro projects, various other older vintage offsets which had struggled in the traditional voluntary carbon market. This found a new home for them, really. So we saw lots of India wind, India large hydro, other industrial projects, all being absorbed, and a lot of those projects were projects, Turkey Hydro as an example, projects that had struggled to find homes. So in the international space, and so it's kind of a new lease of life for these projects. We're a volume player, so we trade on wholesale in volume, and so the prices began around June time, around 2 to 250 USD. In good volumes initially, companies trading typically on a monthly basis, because they were trying to familiarize themselves with the process. I think everyone at that stage was the same. The ministry were not sure about the documentation, and the VCS and the registries were helping to kind of process how that would function. But what we saw quite quickly with competition and with international players becoming more involved was the prices quickly settled to sub $1. And that was driven partly because projects which were not considered started to make themselves available. Also, volumes increased. So as everyone became more comfortable, the registries were happier. Companies were happy to provide these projects. The end prices again came under pressure because there was a lot more competition from offset companies, from retailers, from traders, and then there were some domestic companies as well who started to play a larger role. So there was a real crossover between the two markets. As you can see from the graphs, there's a breakdown here of some of the data we have. It largely focused on renewables, and typically, like the international voluntary space, China, India, Turkey had a large holding, and Thailand there had some significant volumes traded as well from specific projects. The vintage focused around 2012. I think it was kind of a mid-range. People felt more comfortable initially doing the newer vintages rather than going towards the older side of 2010, and obviously staying away or attempting to, for a cost reason, for the newer vintages from 2014 to 16. But as volumes reduced in the latter part of the year, we started seeing people moving towards those newer vintages. in terms of depth and supply and demand outlook, there are 90 projects registered currently for Colombia. There are more in the pipeline. There are around 25 ECS projects, with the bulk of volume coming from forestry and AFALU projects. The CDM, there are 65 projects registered. Only a handful of both VCS and CDM projects have actually verified and produced compliant volumes. Many of the CDM projects stalled once the CDM prices collapsed post 2012. They saw no financial reason to continue. Many continued to monitor, but they weren't verifying. And so projects that do exist, or some that are available now, have compliance period 1 credits from the EU ETS. Now, if you can separate them by vintage into through the monitoring reports and through the periods, then they're compliant under the decree 926, the Colombia carbon tax, as long as they're 2010 plus vintage. I think the issue is obviously getting them to market. So many of these players aren't familiar with the registry system. Many people have left, others not available. Some haven't paid their issuance fees, for example, so there's a cost. So there's a slight complication there, but it's woken up that market again, and we're starting to see people looking at CDM a lot more. In the short to mid-term, there's a short of supply, and it's been pushing the prices higher, closer to the $5 tax price. And off the back of that, and I think in anticipation of increasing prices and short supply, we've seen many of the large entities pushing for tenders and requests for projects to secure forward volumes for 2018 and 2019. Only a third of the CDM projects registered and a fifth of the VCS projects registered had verified credits, with the majority of volume from the domestic scheme coming from only 2 or 3 projects at this stage. I think around June we'll see, and possibly earlier, we'll see some more significant volumes being issued, which should relieve some pressure and make contracting slightly easier. In terms of the challenges that are facing players, the supply side risks are fairly high. They're reducing as everyone gets more comfortable. Standard contracting was delivery versus payment mechanism, and particular for this, for the domestic tax, publicly retiring credits in advance of approval by the ministry. And payment being subject to approval. Now, this left suppliers in a slight grey area, because there was a risk the project could be rejected. You still had a contract, or you lost the credits you'd submitted. So you had to be fairly confident and know which projects are applicable. It lowered competition, I think, because it meant that only certain entities who had that knowledge, but also the financing, to be able to wait for the 30 to 45 day period for approval to happen. And that leads on to the next point, which is the invalidation risk. In previous systems like the EU ETS, before trading commenced, a white list was produced, which typically listed all the applicable projects, which gave confidence to the traders and to participants that anything they bought from those that was contained within that list was applicable, was approved, had been vetted. No such list was created by the Colombian ministry or by the petroleum companies, and so it created a grey area again, where people weren't sure what they were transacting, or if what they were transacting would be accepted. I think going forward, it's definitely spurred companies to come back into the market. They see demand there. There's certainly many of the players that we've been speaking to, people we've had contact with for years, are now saying that they have lots of interest coming from new counterparties looking at their volumes. Many require financing, many projects require restarting or certainly tweaking. Their monitoring's old, or they need new verifications or changes to methodologies and so on. But there are projects there, and I think it's very positive. We've seen a lot of interest from not just the Colombian space, but the international market. It's given another avenue to the market itself, and the international element, so to making the credits fungible between systems, where older credits kind of dormant in the international market, as newer players, as European players look to newer vintages, has given kind of new life and will probably breathe some more verifications into projects which look like they would just peter out. And certainly in the Colombian space, there's new project activity that we're seeing now, and that's it from me. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Gareth. I think we're all really excited about the Colombian market. I know here at Ecosystem Marketplace, we first started tracking a lot of cancellations happening on through VCS. Well, on one of the registries last year on market, but yeah, it seems like there's a lot going on, and really cool to know that some of the older vintages are still seeing demand. So I'm going to turn over now to Christian Danica. Let me figure out how to do that really quickly.
Does it work already?
I think so. I'm just going to have my PowerPoint up in the background, and I added your name to our list of speakers. Yeah, and I think you're good to go. So Christian Danica, everyone, is the Director of Sustainable Supply Chains and Land Use at South Pole Carbon, and I'm sure he can also maybe provide a bit more of an introduction himself. So take it away.
Great, thanks, Kelly, and hello everyone. And sorry for no slides, but I came in a little bit last minute, so all I can offer is my voice at this time. And Gareth, thanks for your introduction. I won't repeat on the carbon tax, but I wanted to expand a little more on what other drivers were there before the carbon tax kicked in, and what has this brought beyond saving tax. Just quickly, South Pole, some of you might know us. We're a company that works in emission reductions, renewable energy, and sustainable supply chains around the world. We have about 50 plus people in Colombia working on those topics. And what we have seen basically is that before the carbon tax came in, there was a very innovative initiative by Fundación Natura and other actors in the ministry that drove awareness, that drove carbon footprint development of up to 40 companies, that drove the development of a suite of small but beautiful projects, and that created the basis of know-how for this scheme. So there was a certain level of consciousness already in the country, and there were few companies, rather the large ones, the international ones, those reporting to CDP or to Dow Jones Sustainability Index that had already taken action. What we have seen though is that through the carbon tax you have actually a double whammy impact. One is that of course fuel prices go up, and for airlines, for example, a 2% or 3% fuel price hike is quite substantial. And then, of course, the other impact was that if you are a company that can certify emission reductions, you save another $5 because you can credit those to your own obligations. So in a way, there's an incentive of up to $10 per ton to reduce emissions. And that drove one client of us, for example, a large consumer goods company, to actually kick off a really dedicated search for mitigation opportunities in their own operations. And they found opportunities such as switching to other fuel for their transport fleet, or using electric vehicle loading and offloading cars. And other companies have dusted off their own land investments or their land holdings that they might have had in the past and which now enjoy an additional financial support through the carbon tax, because there's beyond VCS and gold standard also local protocol you can use for certifying certain types of forest projects. Other companies use this as a marketing opportunity. LATAM Airlines, for example, they had been offsetting their ground emissions, and then they offset, of course, their complete flight emissions because that was beneficial financially. And as a third step, they then said, well, then we might as well offset ourselves completely. And now they are the first carbon neutral Colombian airline that I know of. And they did, of course, some good marketing around this as well. Another airline is actually going forward and said, okay, if we offset already our flights, we can also offer to our passengers to offset additional flights, for example, those that go internationally, because that is not covered by the scheme. So marketing opportunities here and cost saving opportunities here beyond just paying offsets. Other developments that were not so much related to the carbon tax, especially here in the country, are probably those related to large corporates asking their suppliers to take action. We are seeing more and more demand for either carbon or renewable energy from companies that have been asked to do so by their clients. Some of them also have been asked to take other action in sustainability. One example, HSBC asking all their clients to tell them how they take action in the face of climate change. And there's other companies, for example, that joined the TFA 2020 Colombia chapter, which was founded, which is focused on avoiding deforestation through commodities. Finally, one other example I would like to give is some companies in Colombia that took the insetting approach, which basically means that you reduce emissions, you certify them according to a decent standard, and then you use them to report yourself carbon neutral, but in your own area of influence, in your own operations or with the communities around them. And one example I want to give is Conexión Jaguar, the Jaguar Connection. It's an initiative by ISA, by Pantera, an NGO, and by South Pole, which basically says, why don't we work on projects where our power lines are? They're the grid company, so they have a lot of power lines across Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And why don't we try to reduce emissions, but at the same time improve our community relations where we work, and at the same time connect the biodiversity corridors of the jaguar, and for the case of Chile, the puma, because there's no jaguar. And I think this is a very good example to go beyond saving some money on tax, but actually taking sustainable action in these three dimensions. Those are the quick point I wanted to give you, in addition to the Colombian tax, which of course, in terms of tons moved and money involved, is still orders of magnitude larger than all these other drivers, but maybe this changes in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Christian. I think it's always really exciting and validating just to hear of companies that still continue to go above and beyond compliance requirements to take voluntary action. Since, of course, the bulk of what we report on here is voluntary markets. So it's always good to hear that that still isn't shut out from compliance activity, but actually it's augmented by it. So then I'd also just like to turn our attention to our last panelist, Mariana Calva from Mexico CO2, who's from Mexico and will be speaking about Mexico instead of Colombia. So let me just see if I can switch the slides, because I'll be sharing them from my screen. Okay, hang with me just a minute. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll try this again. Okay, perfect. So I will have this up, and then Mariana, if you can just please let me know when to go to the next slide. Oh, and sorry, I think you're muted. You should try again now.
Thanks, Kelly. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I hope that all the information and Mexican experience will be useful for you. I'm going to start talking about the national context in climate change, then about what we do as Mexico CO2, and also about the general scenario of the voluntary carbon market. And finally, I will talk about the opportunities and challenges for these markets in Mexico. The next, please. Thank you. Well, about the national context, Mexico, as you know, has a high vulnerability to climate change. An example of this is increase of the temperature. In the north of the country, we have experienced an increase between 1.2 and 1.5 Celsius degrees. The sea level has risen from 17 to 21 centimeters in the last 100 years. So because of that, Mexico has a high economic and social cost. Only between 2001 and 2013, around 2.5 million people were affected by climate change. And the economic cost of this impact were about $16 million. I put the number in Mexican pesos, but it's about $16 billion. And that's why Mexico has decided to take actions against climate change. And Mexico developed the General Climate Change Law in 2012 and the Energy Transition Law in order to develop environmental market mechanisms. For the Paris Agreement, Mexico committed to 22% GHG reduction by 2030. This is an unconditional goal. We go to the next, please. Thank you. Mexico CO2 was created in order to develop environmental markets. Mexico is a company from the Mexican Stock Exchange. Our mission is to tackle climate change through encouraging public and private sectors to take part in emission reductions to meet the targets defined by the Paris Agreement on climate change. We have two main areas in our company, but today I'm going to present the area where we have two projects. There is the voluntary carbon market and the carbon market exercise. So you see down the slide are the executive committee of the voluntary carbon market of Mexico CO2. That means that they evaluate each new project to be listed in Mexico CO2. And we have from the left to the right, the Mexican Stock Exchange, the British Embassy in Mexico, the Ministry of Environment, the National Commission of Forestry, the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change, and finally the United Nations Environment Program. Next, please. Here we have the voluntary carbon market in Mexico. Mexico CO2 has developed the voluntary carbon market since 2015, and we have traded about 40,000 tons of CO2. As you can see, it's a very small market, and the price range per offset goes from 2.7 to 26.3 USD. It's a very small market because of many reasons that I explain in the next slide. But this is our total volume of offsets traded between 2015 and 2017. Next, please. Well, yeah, perfect. I'm going to talk a little bit about our projects. In Mexico CO2, we have sectors and standards. Currently, Mexico CO2 has 15 different projects around the country, and all of our projects are certified under international standards such as CDM, BCS, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standards, and all the projects are under the sectors like reforestation, afforestation, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and waste management. Next, please. Those are projects that Mexico CO2 promotes. We have 2 reforestation or afforestation projects. In spite of the potential, because it's very difficult for the communities to pay for a BCS or for a gold standard certification. So they cannot produce carbon offsets. Most of our projects are under CDM, and they are landfill projects. Next, please. Well, now I'm going to talk about the obstacles and challenges in the voluntary carbon market in Mexico. And in first place, we have that there is a lack of interest from private sector. Support and budget directors of the companies to the emissions compensation. They don't see the emissions compensations as priority. So it's very difficult to arrive with the private sector and to promote the emissions compensation. The emissions compensation is not profitable to companies. And so this job is not just a matter of selling offsets, but also it's a matter of education with the private sector. And at the end, this is a voluntary mechanism, and I know that this is the name of the mechanism, but for the companies, it's difficult to understand. It's difficult to take the responsibility of their actions and the consequences on climate change. That's why it's very difficult, the voluntary carbon market in Mexico. Also, if you see the prices of the carbon offset, as I mentioned before, it was like $2.6 per offset. So if you compare the price in Mexico with the European offset, there is a big difference between the prices. So it's very difficult for the private sector. Go to the next, please. However, we have identified 4 new opportunities for the voluntary carbon market in Mexico. The first is the emissions trading system. Well, now we have the carbon market exercise. In second place, we have the carbon tax that ESER enforced in 2014. And then we have the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. And finally, we have the Mexican Rule 173 for forestry projects. Next, please. Well, to introduce private sector to an ETS, the Ministry of Environment and Mexico CO2 are conducted an exercise so the most polluting companies of the country understand how an ETS works and what they could do to reduce their emissions. The exercise also aims to make the private sector part of the political decision. Next, please. The exercise will be running for 9 months, divided in 3 cycles with a full consultation after each phase to analyze the participants' performance. We already finished the first phase and the outcomes are going to be presented next week, but this information is only for the participants and is not public yet. All information relating to the companies in the simulation is fictitious, for example, financial resources, allowances, emission reductions, the company's names, etc. We have 90 companies participating in the exercise, and it is important to say that in the exercise, it is allowed to cover up to 10% We don't know how the ETS will be. We don't know how the rules are going to be in the future. But this is an exercise that will help to the government and the private sector to make better decisions. Next, please. Well, in carbon market exercise, we have an advisory committee that is integrated by the Private Sector Studies for Sustainable Development Commission, Panelists in Spanish, the Environmental Defense Fund, International Carbon Action Partnership, the International Emission Trading System Association, and also the governments of Quebec, California, Ontario, and as well as Mexican governments like Nuevo León, Mexico City, and Jalisco are participating in this advisory committee. And they are trying to design the new rules and solve potential conflicts or situations during the market exercise and probably in the ETS. Next, please. Well, now I'm going to talk about the carbon tax in Mexico. And as you know, the carbon tax is the simplest solution to combat environmental externalities. However, the carbon tax cannot guarantee a certain amount of GHG reduction. This is a problem in terms of compliance with environmental goals, such as NDCs. The carbon tax was introduced in Mexico in 2014. It applies only for use of fossil fuels, but does not apply for natural gas. The current price is 2.2 USD per ton. This is one of the lowest prices around the world. Nowadays, Pemex is the main company required to pay the tax. Pemex oil company, it's a state company, by the way. Estimated revenue from the carbon tax in 2014 and 2015 was about $800 million. The Ministry of Finance allows the payment of 20% of the tax through offsets. Only Mexican CDM projects apply for the carbon tax. And a secondary regulation in this matter was published last December. The revenue from the carbon tax is channeled to the general expenditure of the country, so it's not channeled to mitigation or adaptation projects. That is a negative aspect of the carbon tax. And the carbon tax is a relative opportunity for the voluntary carbon market, and I will explain you why. So we go to the next, please. Yes. Well, we have, I want to explain you the offset cycle in the carbon tax. So imagine that Pemex, that is the oil company, has to pay the carbon tax. So Pemex will not compensate its emissions. Pemex will buy the ownership or the titles of the offset. So the Ministry of Finance receives offsets and gives them to the Service of Administration and Disposal of Goods, the SAE. SAE, according to the rules of operation of the carbon tax, has a duty to sell the offsets. So at the end of the cycle, we have an end buyer who finally compensates emissions. We, as Mexico CO2, disagree with this policy because we think that the Ministry of Finance lost the environmental purpose of carbon. They are not encouraging to the private sector to reduce their emissions. They are not encouraging to the private sector to compensate their emissions. The Ministry of Finance is receiving and creating an economic value, but they lost the environmental and the value of the carbon project. That's why I say that this is a relative opportunity for the voluntary carbon market. Can we go to the next, please? Thank you. Well, we have also the CORSIA program that is implemented by ICAO. And the main purpose of CORSIA is to have a carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. And the standards accepted by CORSIA are CDM projects and BCS. So Mexico is the fifth country with more CDM projects. That is a big opportunity for all projects. And concerning to BCS, well, we have like 4 or 5 projects under BCS. And as I mentioned before, BCS is a very complicated standard for us because of the high cost it represents to have the certification. Can we go to the next, please? Mexico announced its voluntary participation in the pilot phase. That means that Mexico are going to receive special support to build capacity, and we are going to start participating in 2020. But the principal airlines in Mexico, there is Volaris and Aeromexico, they already compensate their emissions since 2015. So it's not going to be a problem for them. Can we go to the next, please? And finally, we have the Mexican rules that was established by the National Forestry. And the purpose of this rule is to reduce carbon projects by increasing carbon stocks. This is a relative opportunity for Mexican projects because this rule presents advantage and disadvantage. Concerning to the Mexican rule is less expensive than the international standards such as BCS or gold standard. The Mexican rule has a high quality of the methodologies for the quantification of CO2 reduction because they use methodologies of BCS. And Mexico has a lot of potential for the development of forestry projects. By contrary, they are not projects developed under the Mexican rules. We don't know why, but they are not projects developed under the Mexican rules. Or something like that. Mexicans and transnational companies prefer to compensate their emissions from international standards and the Mexican rules. So that is a big problem for the Mexican Rule 173. And finally, the carbon tax does not take into account the Mexican rules. The carbon tax, if you remember, only takes into account the CDM project. So again, this is a relative for Mexican projects. In short, Mexico has to work with private sector to create interest and also has to work to create integrated policies. Mexican institutions have to coordinate their work and effort to follow the same path. And in the private sector has to take responsibility in their actions on climate change. Taking this into account, we can develop a better voluntary carbon market in Mexico. And I think this is all the opportunities that we have for now in Mexico. 2 of them are relative opportunities, but we are increasing the voluntary carbon in Mexico since 2015. So I think we as Mexico CO2 are trying to do our best in the voluntary carbon market in Mexico, but there is a lot to do by the private sector and by the public sector. And can we go to the next, please? Yeah, well, so I think that's everything for me.
Great, thank you so much, Mariana. I think it's really interesting that you can have countries with sort of a similar law, in this case, the tax on fuel, but the policy differences can really have very different market impacts in terms of how much activity we see around offsets. I'm glad everyone can learn about what's happening in Colombia and in Mexico. And I think now we are going to switch over to questions. I know we've run a little bit over, but if people on the line don't mind staying, we can start answering questions. And if you do have to leave, please type in the questions anyway, and we'll follow up via email to try and answer whatever you are wondering. So with that, I think Melissa Gallant is one of my colleagues here at Ecosystem Marketplace, and she actually just joined in April of last year, and we're really excited to have her on board. So she's going to read through and moderate the questions.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, if you do have questions, go ahead and write them into the question box, and we'll do our best to get to them. And if not, we'll follow up later by email. But we've got some good questions to start off with. First of all, there's one about pricing of carbon offsets. I know that's come up in a couple of our presentations. So the question is, what is the range of prices? And the person asking the question said we sold offsets for 20 cents, which is quite a bit different from the $3.80 average that Kelly mentioned. So maybe folks could just speak a little bit to that price range that we see.
Yeah, I can take this first, but I'm sure probably other panelists also want to respond. I definitely, when we report on the averages, that masks a huge range and variation in actual pricing. So, when we report, if it's, $3.8 per ton on average, what we sometimes see is actually lows that are in the 20 cents per ton or sometimes even lower. And sometimes we see other transactions that are upwards of $50 per ton. So there's quite a difference. And typically, the reasons for that difference can vary, but in several cases, I think it's that if buyers are looking for something really specific, and there's not much supply out there, that can drive prices up. In some cases too, some projects might try and sell not just the carbon offset aspect of their project, but some of the community or biodiversity benefits, and try and sort of market that as being more valuable, and thus, they need more money to support their project. But I don't know if anyone else would also like to take a stab at responding to that.
Hey, Kelly, it's Gareth here from Mirko. There's a wide range of reasons as to why the prices are so widely distributed or widely distributed. Technology is very important. So if customers have concerns around technology like they did at the beginning of the Colombia market, where they were looking specifically for renewables, because the rules were fairly vague, they didn't set in stone which technology will be accepted. So companies looked for kind of safe bets. So typically wind, mid-range, so not 2010, not 2016, but something in the middle, basically playing for the center ground to be safe. Also, there was less competition, so there was a lot more time was invested to educate those customers as to what was needed, teaching them about the contracts, setting them up with maybe registry accounts. There's a lot of time that goes in. That's when the prices were higher. As and the volumes are much smaller, as everyone became more familiar, and competition increased, new entrants, then there was a lot more pressure. Larger volumes, older vintages, and industrial projects started to be traded, and that's when the really low prices started to move. So large hydros, energy efficiency projects, things like that. So that's the effect. As Christian said, some companies, despite the cost reductions, were looking actually for impact. So they were willing to pay higher prices, even for the international offsets, because they weren't treating it strictly as a compliance system where they're looking for a unit at the lowest cost, but looking for something they could also use for CSR, their marketing and so on internally or in their reports. And so therefore they were willing to pay a higher price. So hopefully that explains some of the reasoning behind the variations.
This is Christian. I can just quickly add to that. I guess 2 points. One is that in Colombia, you don't have too much of the typical setups that you might need for producing low cost emission reductions. Example, you don't have, like in Brazil, very large pieces of privately held land where one guy can say, let's conserve this, and then, you know, sell a substantial amount of carbon. It's much more community work, complex setups. Yeah, and this the same applies to the energy sector. With one exception, there is no very large-scale renewable energy investment happening, as might be the case in China and India, which might lead then to those huge renewable energy projects with good amount of carbon.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have a problem with my audio, so I don't know if you can write the question on the chat, please.
Oh, yeah, let me do that really quickly just now. The main question is just why is there a range in voluntary offset pricing in Latin America? Marianne, I just sent the question to you. Can you see it on your end?
Okay, perfect. I will already mention that the price range for offset in our market goes from $2.7 to $26.3. It's a very high price, but that represents the cost for the community that take them to get an international certification. It's very expensive for them to get an international certification under BCS, CAR, Gold Standard, and Plan Vivo. So that's why the price range for offsets goes from 2.7 to 6. And the lowest price that we have sold is 1.5. But this is only for international calls that sometimes we have, and we want to apply for that calls. And the lowest price that we can offer is $1.5 per. Still, it's a high price for the international voluntary carbon market.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So this is kind of a quick follow-up question. What about the pricing of insetting? And I know, Christian, you mentioned insetting in your presentation, and maybe you and Kelly can take a stab at that one. So just how does the pricing of insetting work, and especially in comparison to the price of offsetting?
Sure. I mean, first of all, insetting, of course, generates more benefits than carbon to the investors, because typically it would be in their own supply chain. So they would, by definition, it is in their own supply chain. So they would benefit from all kinds of other benefits, such as more long-term stable supply, certified commodities as opposed to normal commodities, less risk that the communities are in a position to some specific project, and so on. The specific example with the Jaguar connection program, it actually consists in that there is some upfront finance available for carbon development cost and project costs. And there is basically a tender for non-running projects that would get supported. So I can't say what the price difference is, but there's the willingness to upfront invest. And that is also the case for many insetting projects around the world. Actually, almost by definition, because you have to get the project started from scratch as opposed to dig up projects that might be already out there with issued credits. So the price per ton might be substantially higher than what we have seen in these transactions here, but not necessarily, because the co-benefits to the investors are also fairly substantial.
I'll just add as well, so we track offset prices in our annual reports, but we've never tracked insetting equivalent prices. And that is, I think, in part just because typically companies that are doing insetting are sort of keeping all of the finances in-house. And so they might be getting sort of benefits, as Christian was just saying, that are not directly related to the carbon project, but are related to their overall supply chain or value chain. And so we find a really hard time trying to quantify that in a way that you can ask sort of the same questions to all different companies doing insetting, because I think all of those projects are a lot more sort of unique, versus with offsetting projects, you sort of always have the common denominator of an offset and a tradable price that you can ask about. So we've never actually really systematically tracked that in our data sets, just because the nature of insetting is quite a bit different from that of offsetting.
Thank you. So we've got a few questions here about the Colombian tax and where those offsets are coming from. So the first one is, why was this decision made to use only international voluntary credits and not CDM credits? And then the second one is about the switch from using international credits to only Colombia-based credits. Why was that decision made to switch to Colombian credits given the lack of supply? And do we think that that is going to be permanent? So maybe, Gareth, you can start off on that one. If anybody else wants to weigh in, then go ahead.
Sure. In terms of the reason for using VERs rather than CERs, I think there was a worry about double counting initially. So credits being used in both a compliance market and then being double counted in a domestic tax. There is a voluntary portal on the CDM where you can retire credits. So it could have been kind of looked over, but they chose to do that as a ministry. In terms of the use of international offsets, there is an undersupply of domestic tons. I think there was a 6-month gestation period to get people familiar with trading, for them to understand, and then to try and transition everyone into the Colombian space. We believe that from discussions that it will stay as it is now, that Colombian projects will be the mainstay of that market. However, there is undersupply, and discussions were made to maybe extend that period of international use. But where we are now is that we're looking at domestic tons to spur either the renewal of existing CDM projects or new offset schemes and mechanisms.
I can add quickly. I think first off, why not international CRs? I understood it was actually meant to avoid oversupply, which hasn't really worked because VRs are also an oversupply from international sources. But this transition period was actually in from the start, and from basically the May version of the decree. And it was meant for the local community of project developers to line up their credits and have like a half a year of transition phase. And I think also the reason that the credits have to be now only Colombian is that this, of course, is a mechanism to hopefully develop rural areas that desperately need funding, especially after the peace process. And it's politically hard to defend that you would say $5 on the tax that would go to the state by funding Chinese projects. It's just politically not easy.
Thank you. So another couple of questions kind of looking at the relative success in terms of emissions reductions and just the slight differences, or the differences between the Mexican and the Colombian carbon taxes. So one question is about the Mexican tax law. Have there actually been any credits transacted because of the Mexican carbon tax? And also, what is the relative size of the Colombian tax versus the Mexican tax in terms of the emissions reductions?
Mariana, do you want to take a first stab at the Mexico side of things?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, the secondary regulation about the payment of the tax through offset was published last December. So until now, Pemex haven't paid the carbon tax with offset. All the carbon tax is paid by money, not offset. So we don't know how it's going to change the carbon tax in that sense. We don't know how many offsets the Ministry of Finance will receive from the carbon tax, and we are waiting for the implementation of this process. But the truth is that Pemex will not compensate its emissions. Pemex will buy titles or will buy the ownership of the offset to pay the carbon tax. So we disagree with this aspect, but it's something that the Ministry of Finance is doing right now, and we don't know how it's going to change the carbon tax. But there are not offsets right now in the carbon tax traded.
I can add on the Colombian size of the pie. It's about 50 to 60 million tons of carbon that are covered by the tax. And the amount, I think Gareth mentioned the amounts of offsets used, and I don't recall, but I think it's in the range of 3.5 to 5 million tons last year and substantially more this year.
Yeah, that's right. So it was over 3 million tons of international offsets in that 6-month period. And to date, I think it's about 2.5 million tons of Colombian volume, which has been retired, but that's excluding the contracted forward volumes because typically it's submitted on a monthly basis. So as the year goes on, we'll see those contracts come to fruition. So it will be much larger. It's not clear at the moment because pricing's not. Some companies are considering paying the fee as opposed to the tax for the simplicity, because the prices have crept close to the carbon tax level simply because there's undersupply.
Interesting. All right, well, with that, I think we'll wrap up this webinar. Thanks everyone for sticking around a few minutes afterwards. I think it's always great to go through questions and answers. And just thanks again to all our panelists. I think this was a really great discussion. It's always great to hear from people who are very plugged in on the ground to find out what's going on. So thanks very much.
And just to add to that really quickly, as a reminder, we will have this webinar recorded and it will be available online. And I know we didn't quite get to all of the questions. We're stopping now because of time, but we will follow up individually with anyone whose questions we haven't answered. So once again, thank you all. And thank you again to our panelists. I learned a lot and I hope everyone else did as well.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ecosystem Marketplace, everyone. Speak to you soon.